give everyone a few minutes to shift around here, but good morning. All right, let me begin. What we started out on this journey of looking at what the digital business analysts of the future would look like. So we started looking at how can we from the business analysis community continue to make ourselves relevant and make ourselves more multi-skilled, which interestingly in the last speaker spoke about many of the same concepts of what we're seeing as a breakdown of the classic roles across all professions, not just business analysis. What in the past, the role definitions were pretty clean, and we delineated those roles. Now the edges of roles are getting fuzzy from all directions. And what we see is more what we refer to as hybrid roles, or the T-shaped individual, where it's not just one-dimensional, one linear dimension of capability, but it includes multiple capabilities. So we're going to talk about the context of that relative to in the digital space and what that will look like. So what we came up with of these notion of the BA best practices. So this topic is going to speak in detail about the first, but let me take a moment here to show you just the context of it all around all of these bubbles, including the ones that are grayed out. We highlighted in red the strategic imperative one to identify which one we're going to focus on in this session. But I'm going to give a little bit of background about the context of them all. So to begin with, to understand the strategic imperative, and if you think about this, yesterday morning I talked about strategy and strategy to execution, and that's looking at that top-down point of view of enterprise-level thinking, and there's some element in the existing BA BOK about at the project level. So we're expanding on that and looking at, in the digital space, that's even more important to understand what the strategy framework is, or the strategic imperatives are around trying to get to framing the digital solution. So we'll go into that in just a bit, but the other item up here is empathizing with the customer, right? So this is customer first, experience based. That's critical to understanding, and it comes after framing up what is the strategic imperative that we're looking for. So that is one of the additional papers that we have out there, is looking at customer experience, customer empathy as a key thing. And then we're looking towards the third item up here that's grayed out is reimagining the business processes. So there's two aspects of this. In business analysis, we've always included business process analysis work. That's part of what being a business analyst is all about. We're now saying take that and do a reimagination, look deeper into what can be, and by using digital technologies in that reimagining process. So it's no longer feeling like the process is constrained to traditional options, but expanding the process changes. And that can go as deep as the situation needs to be. So I think at our workshop on Wednesday was the workshop, time flies, that we looked and did some work to show examples of that. And it still shows that when we're in the digital space, it's still around defining that process flow, examining where the touch points are, trying to reduce the friction in the touch points, and going from there, and then applying digital technology options on top of that. The next item, number 4, is embrace agility. And I thought the prior speakers here from that were on stage before me did a great job of explaining what that means, and just approaching the solution set with an agile mindset. More than, it's not just about Scrum, because Scrum's one particular agile technique. And we're seeing, especially in North America, I think, we see a big move towards Scrum when it comes to custom development. But I think the other concept that's out there that's, I don't want to say it's quite equal, but it's certainly in very high use, and was referred to as more the lean startup mentality, the MVP mentality, to not just look at things in a Scrum-oriented way where things happen every couple of weeks. It may be much longer cycles, but it's defined around what the outcome will be to get that MVP, minimally viable product approach that comes from lean thinking. And we see that with implementations of platform as a service and software as a service, package solution mentality, that it's easier to conceptualize it as a lean approach rather than Scrum-oriented approach. On number 5, we talk about continuous stakeholder engagement, and business analysis has always been about stakeholder engagement. It's one of the core concepts of the BA Bach that we live our profession with. And that is just expanded on here in the digital framework with the word continuous, that it's not just create the stakeholder assessment and get their requirements and document them one time, but it's around continuing collaboration with the stakeholders, and in particular in the digital space with the customer, the end customer, making that a continuous process. And the other that we talk about in this context is how do we do that and become the product solution owner with that notion of the governance model, including continuous collaboration. That's the way to make that really work, is to make sure it is representing the spectrum of all the stakeholders, pulling it all together, basing it on valued decisions, and moving that forward with that frequent, continuous collaboration. The other item 6 up there is about evidence-based decision-making, which really gets into the thinking around the use of data. So we've seen some presentations. The closing presentation yesterday was very focused on data, and we think that that's an important additional depth of the role of business analysis. It's not just the traditional role of looking at how data is used from the internal information systems of an enterprise, but looking beyond that. It's still including that, but going beyond that and looking at data that is extended out. And I see, we'll be doing some more work and evolving this a little bit more in the near future, but looking at how data is actually a tool for the business analysts to help facilitate decision making. It's a new way of us driving out elicitation techniques. So what I mean by that is, if we're going to be end customer focused, we need to take in, it's no longer adequate to just have a focus group approach to gathering information or just an interviewing approach to it, but looking at big data approaches, looking at surveys of customers, looking at information that comes out of our customer service centers and analyzing customer sentiments that come from that, and figuring out what needs to be done to use that data as a form of elicitation of how we drive these projects forward, help shape up how to make the best experience we can. So we are consumers of data. The other aspect of this is to drive out the traditional, business intelligence on steroids kind of approach of its using the data to communicate decisions to the company's decision makers and frame up using the data and the analytics that go along with that to make sure that they feel comfortable that it's based on evidence, not on just anecdotal gatherings. So that changes the paradigm of how we approach with the use of evidence base. And then number 7 is about understanding technology. So it's always been important that we have some grip on the technology, but that's even more important now to understand in the digital space the capabilities of all these various technologies that can be applied to the level of making good decisions about choosing what it is that fits and solves the business problem and drives out that better customer experience, that better stakeholder deliverable. So those are all part of it, but it starts with this improvement in understanding the strategic imperative. So this is the part that's different in digital, where we're looking at constant innovation to drive forward with. So we need to understand what that means in terms of focusing and understanding the strategy of the organization, and then interpreting that to derive out the actual strategic impact that we are playing, or if you're down at the project or initiative level, understanding that impact and what it's having in the context of the initiative. Make sure the business cases are strong, but ROI business cases are not that the ROI part goes away, but the more important point to take away from it is that we're getting the outcome that we wanted to achieve, matching into that strategy imperative context. So that's the difference that we see here, that business cases will get richer and will follow up with metrics that drive that as well. The digital urgency, that's certainly across the board, right? As we see significant increases in the consumer technology area with mobile phones and other experiences that people get used to that level, that we're seeing that as a requirement. And I think some of the demonstrations that you've seen over the course of this conference have shown how that phenomenon is really starting to unfold. And then we want to talk about, the notion of a transformation-oriented thing versus a incremental improvement. We've always had surges of that and different approaches to it to modernize, to drive out different changes in an organization. But the focus of this movement, when we talk about a digital transformation, is around customer centricity. That's what's really the big difference in this. It's not about, and a key point I wanted to make here is the notion of it's tricky, right? Because I think about, I went for my MBA program, and in those days, and the leaders of today tend to be very oriented towards efficiency, that the objective of management was to improve the efficiency of operations as well as the effectiveness. That was the discussion point. It was the point of driving out organizational efficiency, driving out inefficiency. If that paradigm shifts and the notion is that we're to drive out innovation rather than efficiency, those are counter to each other. And it's a challenge of leadership to say that everything we've learned in the last 25 years about being efficiency focused has to be sacrificed somewhat to achieve innovation. When innovation, it's a fail fast, it's a lot of thinking that goes into it, but at the leadership level, the whole notion of interpreting the strategic imperatives has to include a notion of, at least in the initial stages, there's going to be a loss of efficiency as you re-streamline around an innovation approach. So that notion is, I think, is an important one to understand, that we're fighting a whole management culture when we talk about driving out digital. And there's a certain amount of resistance that occurs from that. And it's deep-seated from the, when people were young and getting their MBAs, that they carried that logic forward. And now we're a little bit counterculture to that in what we're talking about today. So these, with the strategic imperatives, I'll go through this. We talked about, I'll start up at the top with the business case, right? It's around how do we go forward and build new kinds of business cases. And this is deep in the heart, in my mind, of business analysis. So when a business case is driven from a project management point of view, and it's really aimed at scope control and schedule control and cost control, we look at those things, and that drives a certain kind of a business case, and it's light on realistic benefits. And I think what we see now is a much stronger, that businesses, to make these large investments, want better and stronger business cases that really focus on the outcomes. And it has to be with that, and it has to be around metrics. And I think overlay that with an agile or stage-gated approach to delivery, and we have to define new ways in which the business case isn't one and done, but it's very dynamic throughout. So I think that's where we look at it, and these improved business cases occur up at the highest level of what these transformation set of sub-initiatives are going to look like, down into the initiative to make sure it carries through with dynamic business case thinking. So I think that's an important lesson to take away, and it has to be driven from the benefit side, the value side. That's what drives it, and that's where business analysis comes in. So rather than being focused on the cost side, look, and then we go through change orders and everything like that in the traditional space, it's now realizing, as we learn and make a better understanding of how to improve customer experience through that learning process, to keep updating the business case with that dynamic and staying focused on the business outcome that's associated with that. The second item here is around strategic clarity, right? Aligning to the business outcomes, so that ties back into the business case, but it's very much focused at outcome orientation. So that is a big part of what we see in this linking of the strategy and purpose, is that the outcome orientation is a really important part of that. And that, I think it's always been there, but it's an increased focus on business outcome rather than project outcomes. Not just achieving the original scope, but flexing out and adapting it so that the business outcome is achieved, not just define project success. The next item around here is using business agility to help realize strategy. And I think there's a lot of creative thought going into this, and our friends at ThoughtWorks here really explained a lot of this. And we're looking at ways in which we can improve this around how that materializes. So as we drive forward and look at, agility in this case is not just agile, it's not just Scrum, as I mentioned before, but it's looking with that agile mindset of placing value high and driving incrementally through change. And that means incrementally at all levels, not just at the software creation level or not just at business process level. And while we're talking about business process and agility, one of the things I think that we've really observed and have seen from some of the case studies is the ability to make changes in an organization. We're now able to change software at a much higher rate than we're able to change the human behavior that goes along with it, the adaptation rate. So I've spoken to a number of companies around the world that are looking at, they actually are intentionally slowing down the outcome because when they were going fast and doing monthly releases, their customers couldn't adapt that fast. So what they've done is they've slowed that down to rates that are more acceptable to the customers in terms of adaptation of the rate of change. So those things are happening out there. It's not like it's an every 2-year thing, although in some organizations it could be. But it's not, that it's updating all the time. Now there are other companies, and certainly the classic is these DevOps type operations where there is a constant change and they're very incrementally small, so the change occurs gradually. But if it's a very transactionally oriented type system, it's harder to do that. For strategic impact, it's about, we talked about this a little bit too, right? It's about how do we make sure the strategic impact is accomplished? And so we've been doing a lot of work recently on this in terms of how do we improve metrics to know that the outcome is actually being delivered. So there are a lot of concepts around this that we're examining, and it's around, some of it could be survey-based. Is the customer experience improving in the eyes of the customer? Well, ask the customers, is it improving? And looking at surveys that say that we're accomplishing what we set out to do in improving customer experience. And then focusing on the aspects of the newest release. I think that kind of thinking of what are those metrics, rather than just metrics around earned value, which has been a classic measure of project accomplishment, is looking at how we do this in terms of improving towards the outcome that we're striving to achieve. So we are very focused on how to measure that strategic impact and how to measure the business outcome in a way that fits with agility and still has the strategic imperative perspective in mind and looking at how to balance those. The other one here is around customer value and the customer experience. That, certainly that's at the core of this, and how that drives, in the digital space especially, it is what drives the whole engine of digital, is to focus on the customer, to focus on all of the stakeholders, but focusing most importantly on that customer experience. I found it interesting, the example of the logistics companies in India, where it was focused on the truck drivers as rather than the end customer perspective. So it took a stakeholder group and focused on theirs. And not to say that that's invalid, but most of what we see in the digital space is based on the true end customer experience. And there is a notion that it also can be turned around to optimize the employee experience as well. So we're looking at, again, how to really create and focus on the value propositions that are around that customer experience and improving the whole value chain around the customer. And taking the context of that's important here relative to strategy is looking at the project in the context of more end-to-end and making sure the total customer experience of what we're delivering in the initiative really fits in the total customer experience, not just the transactions around which the initiative is focused on, but that it integrates through. I think there's an interesting commercial from KPMG that runs in the United States on a pretty regular basis on television. And it talks about that very notion of what we're trying to do to get those better experiences out there and driving all of that in a better way, in the value proposition to do. Strategic execution, kind of in the wrap-up of this, we need to deliver on the change side of these initiatives. Again, with the notion of, we see so many times that the human element is not as focused as it could be. And we need to balance the implementation of the digital artificial intelligence or robotics or whatever that technology that is fitting to the situation, and bring in the human factors around it that drive that change. Again, in transactional systems, that's extremely important to understand how we do that and how we bring along not just the employees, but the community in the end user group to make sure they're adapting to the change. And again, my experience has seen many companies focusing on that and changing their delivery cycles, changing the human organization of the company and the touch points with the users, and how to improve the training experience, how to improve what they need to do in the customer service department. That it takes that holistic view of making sure what we're delivering is accomplishing what we set out to do without, if the objective is to work out the rough points and the handoffs in a transaction system, we don't want to create more aggravation to the customer in doing that. We want to smooth that out. And so the change processes are important to that. Something happened to my... Oh, there we go. Thank you. So here we're talking about how does all this fit. And the notion is these aren't sequential, right? The heart of what this slide is attempting to show is these aren't sequential processes. These are going on together, right? They're intertwining with each other. It's not, you go around the wheel in order in a linear approach to it. These are all multi-dimensional effects that are going on around how to focus on strategy and then how to put it in a context and looking at these multiple dimensions that are going on. So I think the challenge is how to do that and make it fit the context in which you're working, right? How to apply the right emphasis in determining what is the right pace of the change, what is the right orientation, and starting out with, the key fundamentals of it, which is looking at customer experience, looking at change management, looking at technology options, and how to derive those better outcomes. That's kind of the essence of it, but applying all this thinking into that so that you're fulfilling the business outcome that wanted to be achieved, and at the same time balancing out the optimization of the customer experience and balancing out how it all integrates. So again, in that KPMG commercial I referred to, it's about some of these front-end systems not being well integrated to the middle office and back office systems. So we see companies that have gone and done a digital effort, and they've looked at making some front-end improvements, but then their back-end systems, their middle office and back office systems are incompatible. And now we've created a problem. We have a great order experience, but the fulfillment experience falls apart because we're still dealing with the legacy warehousing systems, the legacy logistics systems, that they haven't been aligned to the expectation of the front-end systems that have been made digital and customer-centric. So that this integration of multidimensionality is really an important concept of making sure everything fits. We've always had problems with systems implementation around integration and interfaces of other systems. This compounds it because we're driving substantially different front-end experiences that are trying to tie back to the middle and back office and do so in a consistent way that makes them compatible. So we have to look at that as how we structure and apply analysis to make sure that what we, the expectation and the front end experience can be fulfilled on the back end. So this, even within an individual initiative, we want to make sure that integration thinking happens, and that's why I refer to that as the multi-dimensional approach of our strategic imperative, looking at it in a more end-to-end. I think in a traditional business analysis, we refer to that as systems thinking, right, to look at it holistically. And the same thing applies here, but with some different input points into that. So these are some of the techniques that we've identified and are in our white paper. I'm not going to drain this slide. I think there are things that you're pretty familiar with, but how to do some of these techniques out here that, one of the ones that I think is particularly useful that we don't see as widely used as it could be are things like in the value stream mapping that are out there, and using some other of these techniques that are less common. I think the one in the planning stage that I think needs some more development of the techniques of, that isn't as clearly defined, is minimally viable product. So I'm going to tell you a story of an IIBA implementation that we're doing. And it's around the notion of implementing software as a service. In our case, we were using Salesforce.com. And how do you create in a large implementation like that, it's how do you create what the base set is, because it's not going to roll out every 2 to 4 weeks kind of thing. There's an implementation of the core part of the software and establishing it and looking at what constitutes minimally viable product as one challenge. And then the other challenge that goes along with minimally viable product definition is what are the features and functions that are in that minimally viable product? What meets the customer improvement expectation and what meets the operational expectation? And then looking at like a product roadmap of how to move it forward. So if you look at that concept, it's a very much a business analysis exercise. Is what is the minimally viable product? What is included is the objective to say, well, at a minimum, you have to have everything equal to the legacy system you're replacing. That's the starter. But what improvements are you making from the day you start up the go live? What's included, what's not included? So we're looking at this now with our Salesforce implementation and working through the business analysis techniques of defining how you define a minimally viable product in that kind of an exercise. So we'll certainly share our own experience, but we're gathering up information from other companies about that because software as a service and package as a service, platform as a service rather, really changes the approach that we would use in analysis. A lot of what the techniques that are described in the BA BOK contemplate not the exact set of things. So the basics are there, the same basics apply, but with cloud-based, we used to look at gap analysis type things, even with packaged offerings. We'd take a look at the gap analysis and say, do we customize it or do we change the business process? When you go with software as a service or platform as a service, the options to customize are extremely limited, all right, and can bring in lots of problems. So certainly you can adapt package platform as a service packages through APIs and some level of customization, but essentially that's a trap. If the notion of the platform as a service is the platform is evolving pretty quickly, how do you make sure your APIs are able to adapt to that, or have you built yourself a problem? So I think the challenge in the MVP approach is how do you make sure that you're prepared as an organization to make the business process changes that of what Salesforce parameters allow you without building out too much customization. That's always been a problem in package implementation, but I think in an MVP approach, it accelerates that. And it's been, we've seen it, especially with SAP and large Oracle package implementations. You start the project and it's a year and a half, 2 years later before you deliver it. And that's no longer the case in these things. And the software as a service and platform as a service scenarios, like Salesforce for us, enables you to go much faster, but it also presents challenges of defining the MVP that you're going to start up with and defining how you're going to adapt all your business processes to fit the paradigm of what is actually offered. So it puts the burden back on the business analysis person to actually figure it out and then work on the change processes around those business processes that have to change to adapt to fill the gap that exists now with change rather than software change. It's around process change. So those, I think, are things that we see that are out there. I think the other that's out, I mean, all these things are, the business case models are changing, and we see that. I think the one that, the down here in the lower right on transformation about business process and experience design, I think that's another one. In the context of where we're adapting these large platform or software as a service capabilities, those are things that, again, adapting the process change is really a challenge, and it's a challenge of business analysis. It isn't a technical challenge. It's not something the developers are necessarily going to solve. It's us, the business analyst community, that are really needing to take this on in a new kind of way to make sure that we're on top of examining exactly what business process is changing and how that affects the overall experience of our stakeholders and of in our case, our members that are using the system. That we're making sure that that's a very positive experience, that the change in the process doesn't trip them up where they're not sure what to do as they interact with the system. So it's, it's really that hitting that right balance point and making sure that the change adaptation is well thought through. And again, I think it's about moving the problem from the developer point of view to the business analyst point of view to make it successful. So that's kind of the big takeaway from this. So at this point, what I think I'd like to do is just open it up to questions, and thank you very much for coming. But any questions?
Hello, I'm Sriraj. What I see is it's not the product that are changing, it's the customer experience expectations that are changing. When a few years ago, it was website. You have a website, you can sell something. And then they said app first. You should have an app, otherwise you can't sell stuff. And then they said it's not app, you should have a bot chat or chatbot that helps you sell. And then now they're saying it's not even chatbot or app, you should have something different. You should, as customer walks in to this hotel, you should know that he's here and you have to suggest him something. So the rate at which we are making the customer ask for new expectations is so high, and every company is adapting to something new and again adapt to something else. And in less than 4 years, I think we have transformed into different things. So what do you think? Isn't it a bubble? I feel it's like is there a real ROI on all these changes what we are doing to the products? Because even before you reap your investment on something, we are going to something else. So, and sometimes I see that retail companies today, they run at a loss, like Flipkart says or Amazon says, we run at a loss to capture the market for next 3 years. So, assuming that somebody like Walmart will come tomorrow to India and take someone else. So, this is like, isn't it a real bubble, or do you think this is a real market? Somehow I feel this is a rat race. Everybody wants to have their presence. And then the technology, suppose I've seen in clients who have invested in huge investment in Teradata, and then they suddenly see Teradata is not tomorrow's technology.
Mm-hmm. So you know, the question fundamentally is it a bubble? Is it just a trend, or is this fundamental, right? So I think what we've seen is the new digital technology and customer centricity. Certainly, and I'll use Uber as the classic example, since I think we all know that model, right? When we conceptualize how to approach a problem, and I think I used this earlier when I spoke yesterday, is if we went in and applied our traditional approaches into a taxi cab company, we come out with a more efficient taxi cab company. We'd optimize the dispatch process. We'd optimize the car maintenance process. We'd optimize a number of the silos. But what Uber did is said, let's look at the customer experience and really change that. You know, get rid of not sure when the cab's going to show up by showing on your phone exactly where the car is and how many minutes it's going to be there in front of you. And so it takes some of the anxiety of calling the cab and worry about if they're really going to show up or not so you can get to your appointment. So focusing on that, and I'm just using it as an example, that's fundamental, right? That created a whole new industry for ride sharing that's different from the taxi cab model. So I think in the right scenario, it fundamentally changes the business model, and it changes the value proposition. You still, the business outcome of going from point A to point B in a car is still happening, right? But the way the experience happens, and it also, coincidentally in that case, for the most part, in most cities, has lowered the cost substantially. I know in Philadelphia, my ride from the Philadelphia airport to my home used to cost about $80, 80 US dollars in a taxi cab. And now with Uber, it costs me about $35, right? It's more than half of the cost that it used to be. So I think that's the kind of thing that's pretty fundamental, that it can drive down the cost curve, you know, improve the user experience, you know, the control over what the vehicle looks like. Those taxi cab rides I used to go in, I'd worry whether they even had brakes because the rest of the vehicle was so beat up, right? So it's, you know, when an Uber car shows up, it has to be at least, you know, it has to be a relatively new car. And, you know, I'm confident that Uber does a reasonable job at vetting the drivers and all of that. So there's just a lot of improvements in the experience that are driven from customer centricity. So, but can it be over-applied? Can we overemphasize? You know, I haven't thought of a case where that's true, but there are probably scenarios where it can be, and most of the time, I think it's, you know, the experience where I've personally observed it falling apart and have spoken to a number of companies is where it's not throughout the cycle. You know, it's not just that I ordered the car on my phone. I can't stop at that level. The whole execution through to getting me to my destination had to be re-envisioned and processes redefined, right? So those kinds of approaches can be disruptive to an industry at a fundamental level, and you know, but where there are problematics is where there's front-end experiences. You know, now I have a mobile app, but you know, I'm fighting my back end, so the overall experience wasn't good. My ordering experience was great, but you know, the delivery experience was terrible. And you know, a lot of online ordering. You know, if I look at my Amazon experience in the United States, I order a good many times it's arriving the same day. If I order it in the morning, it's there in the afternoon, right? Because just they've streamlined the whole logistics of package delivery so effectively.
I understand that, see, from the customer front as an experience, yeah, it's a breakthrough. And then the crowdfunding or crowdsourcing, the Uber or anything, have opened a platform where the driver subscribe to a platform, through crowd processing. Perfectly, yes, it has changed the fundamentals of business. My question is more about, it's okay, every time humankind has disrupted the fundamentals to go to next level, and that's expected. But what I feel now is, we are only running to improve the experience so big and so fast, and we're moving on the technology space so rapid. technology of yesterday is not technology of today. Example, you said Salesforce. In today, in workforce, if you have to hire somebody from Salesforce, an architect, I've seen somebody tell me yesterday that it took 6 months in India. India is one of the best talent pool, you know. And then if it takes 6 months in India to hire a Salesforce architect of good quality, it's because people also are moving to different technologies, and people today don't know which technology I should spend more time. Should I spend more time in Salesforce? Should I spend some more time in some different technology? Because the technology landscape is so big now, and then we don't know what is the life of the technology itself. So, and in this long run, what happens, what I assume could happen is, we'll run out of people who are expert at one technology or expert at one area. I don't know, but this is like a very weird, but then it just like...
Yeah, let me take your question and respond in the exact context of IIBA, us as a user-consumer company. So the other part that we're implementing as we speak is to look at the use, you know, and we're a relatively small company. We're not a multi-billion-dollar, we're a non-profit organization, right? So we're looking at the use of artificial intelligence to improve the member experience. And what I mean by that is learn from the interactions of our user to send highly appropriate rather than blasts of email, right? That we don't know whether that message is relevant to that recipient or not because the same message goes to everyone. So what we're doing in the artificial intelligence is gathering information about our members from their self-defined profile and from their actual behavior. What events did they attend? What documents did they open? And looking at all of the experiences and then saying, gosh, this person's interested in digital. This person's much more interested in agile. So when we come out with something, you know, well, it's available to everyone, but our proactive push mentality is driven from artificial intelligence determining what they're really interested in. And so that the application of that kind of thinking and the use of the specific digital technology in artificial intelligence and learning from the data and the responses of membership will make us more effective. So you know the total is you get things that are more relevant to you, and you'll tend to open them because it's not just something else crowding up my mailbox that I don't know whether I care about or not, right? And there's a limit to what you can do to make the subject line catchy. But if you know that it's catchy around something that somebody cares about, their experience is improved. So I think, you know, it's that kind of thinking that's clearly different because our mentality before was we get a mailing list and we send it. And now the mentality is how do we personalize the member experience? So that's a deep concept of making the experience personalized and staying on target with their interest areas rather than blasting them with everything we're pushing out. And to me, that changes the value of membership, right? It makes it more relevant. It makes it less of like, as soon as I see an email from IIBA, hit delete, right? So because I don't know whether it's something about a chapter or promoting some event or whatever, right? So try and, you know, really change the experience. So I think we're living it. We're not just talking about it. I mean, we are talking about it in the sense of talking to a lot of other customers, but I'm relating to you our experience as a relatively small enterprise in the grand scheme of things, and how it can fundamentally change how we deliver our business objective. So, you know, I hope that kind of answers the question.
Good morning, and thank you for the great points. See, keeping customer at the center of what we do, or customer is king, it's not really a new paradigm. However, I believe that in the digital world, maybe some things have changed. Now, as a business analyst working on this strategic intent domain, keeping customer at the center of what we do and doing all our analysis, whatever around it makes sense. However, customer of yesterday is so different from what a customer is today, in the sense that customer is changing almost on a daily basis, right? So when I do as a business analyst, when I do all my work pivoting on something that's constantly changing, how do, as a business analyst, what do I keep track of? Now, you know, the centers keep changing. Am I going around the center, or the circle itself has shifted by the time I finish my the strategic analysis? I know it may come into this continuous cycle, but if I'm pivoting something around which is not fixed, how do I handle this?
Yeah, so a great question, and it gets into the spectrum of customers. So if you say the customer, it's constantly changing, right? And part of that is you want to keep the customer, but their needs are changing, right? You probably want to hold on to the customers that you have because the customer acquisition costs are high, right? Yeah, so it's what products and services you're delivering to fulfill their expectations and their needs, because those needs and expectations are what's constantly changing, right? I think that's what you're saying. I totally agree. And it gets into concepts of when a company at the strategy level at top, it really gets into their product and service roadmaps. And then how do you deliver those effectively? And what analysis goes into, for us as business analysts, how do we feed in to those product and service manager level road mapping plans and do the right analysis to help guide them in what understanding the primary job of the product managers in companies is to understand what the customers and market are asking for, and then the business analyst helps determine what the analytics that are appropriate to substantiate that, and is it just a fashion-oriented trend? It's like going to last for 6 weeks, or is it a more enduring change in what's out there? And help with the product planning, and that in turn would change the mix of your supply chain, perhaps, of who you're buying the needed products for. But I think it's around managing that whole experience of what is the business outcome you're looking for with a customer centricity point of view, and understanding the marketplace, and the role of the business analyst is providing the solid analysis to help the product and service product managers make good decisions about how to fulfill customer expectation and customer needs. I think that's the way it'll happen, and I don't know exactly. We're working on that very concept now around the product management support of business analysis is something that we'll have sometime in 2019. So those are kind of 2 or 3 of the top level things we're working on. A product manager integration look, and looking at data analytics is something that are those two combined.
Can I add something here?
Yes.
I really want to congratulate you. Phenomenal question, because people get stuck, BA community especially. I think they get bogged down by this customer mindset, and I think the changing need of the customer is what is driving this changing behavior. And many a times, in what we are observing in the consulting world, is that customers do not even know what they want at times, and that's where digital is coming in. That's where these new experiences are evolving. And I think Ken has already addressed most of it. There are a couple of additions I want to make. If you relate your question back to the best practices that we're talking, when Ken started the session, embracing agility, having product mindset, some of those things are being thought out, which will enable for you to address being real to the customer that you're trying to engage with. Right? So that's the intent of those best practices, and we're trying to support the experiences of this community, like what you described, from the content and the best practices point of view. Thank you. Thank you, Ken. Great
Thanks,
answer,
Ashish.
I would also like to add something, but before that, let me introduce myself and my profession, because that will able to correlate better. I will address yours as well as, just with your permission. Can I go ahead?
Yes,
add
sure.
my view? Okay. I am professor and I teach a student, and I have a similar kind of concern what you have said, that daily customers are changing, their demands are changing, other side technology is changing. What I will say over here, if you see one concept I would like to introduce, and I am seeing from yesterday also, Maslow's hierarchy of the need. Okay, in that one, what happens that human, their needs keep changing, and it goes something like that. In the first level, they will need food, shelter. Second level, they will need security. At the third level, love, experience. Fourth level, actualization. So right now, anyway, if you see carefully, technology has provided, in the beginning, the focus was effectiveness, efficiency, that at the food level, basic minimum level. But now our technology is, after the BPR, business process and all those, they are able to provide that minimum requirement. So now, if you add that theory, now we are, and that theory has been given maybe 100 years back, Maslow had, okay? And if you relate with that one, now we have fulfilled the minimum, now we want more experience. Like you you seen yesterday how the claim gets settled online. So the point here I want to make, that the moment we fulfill one need, another will arise. That's ongoing process. Second thing, technology, solution provider, they need business. They have to keep growing. So they will create a need, and they will say that we have solution for why you don't want this. You see, you need it. You have already crossed. Your stomach is fulfilled. Now let us go, and you have money in your pocket. Let us go to the Sheraton, have a dinner over there. So it's like that. Now, in that case, what I recommend my student, generally, okay, this theory I give, and I keep telling that, okay, I was also from software industry. I started from COBOL, mainframe system, then come like, oh, Java will change the world. Okay, it will connect everything. Then it came that, okay, maybe later, cloud, SMAC, they will keep. So what I say, understand the business, okay, and just learn little bit high level of all the available tool and try to mix match. Don't try to master everything, one thing, and then you think that, okay, I have to apply, and I have to stick to that technology. Don't do. Mix and match. You have to understand the toolkit. These things are in my toolkit. Business problem will be there, and you have to learn how to apply those toolkits. So, of course, that is a puzzle. This is how we grow. Even the GDP, everything you see. So, it will keep on going. Customer will keep changing, and we have to live in that world. If you try to come out of that, you will have a future like Kodak and whatever.
So
Okay.
let me ask you to wrap it up. And, it's interesting, if you can figure out the key to digital self-actualization, you'll be a billionaire.
Okay, thank you very much.
You had a question? Yeah, yeah.
Okay, hi. So just taking it forward from what we just discussed, the customers have experienced such high customer experience, like we want to see real time, we need to know what is going on, we want to be in control of everything. Now, that is actually driving customer to expect in every phase of life they want that control. So my question is more from the companies where they are trying to innovate. So there are many legacy companies, new age companies are able to meet and they are able to focus and get into that. But there are legacy companies which are working very well, there is no problem as such, but they're trying to now adopt to digital. They came up with some app or they come up with some new digital experiences. But customers would never be happy because they will compare with a much more newer thing and they don't feel the same level of control, correct? So whatever they do, it is not enough. So my question is more from a business analyst community perspective of how you define that scope. so that it's enough for the customers still able to meet the business, because you cannot keep on doing things which customer want and it's not making much meaning for the business, core business as such, correct? So there's a gap there, correct? So how do you bridge that gap, and what should the BA community should focus on, so that, because it's ultimately defining those requirements, what to give to the customers. They may have huge expectation end to end, but it's more about balancing that expectation. So how do you do that? And what's your thoughts around that? That's my question.
So I think that's a great question, and one, I'm going to answer it in the context of what do you need in terms of the capabilities of an individual. And I think the response is we see a lot of need for multiple forms of capability. It's being the expert and being business savvy, and then applying how to relate that to other aspects. And you can't be an expert in every digital technology. You can't be an expert in everything about Agile. And so it gets down to a just-in-time mentality. What do you need to do? What's next? And it gets into adaptive learning, learning it in time with enough support to achieve what you need to do that next gig, whether you're an employee on a project or whether you're a contractor. It's gig readiness is a part of it. And the other, at the management level, is recognizing that you may need a team of business analysts and be leveraging different people at different times to achieve things. So there's the continuity component, and then there's drop-in experts of expertise that may need to come to bear on it. So I think, and certainly that's the concept of Agile and Scrum, right, is it's team-oriented, and not anyone possesses all the knowledge or does any one thing. It's about what you can achieve when you put together a team, that the team has the right skills or the access to the right skills and competency to execute what they need to execute. So I think that's the context in which I'd answer that. You can't be an expert in everything. I think it's being an expert at what's needed at the time, and then being quickly able to learn the things that you don't have in your immediate tool bag, and bringing in others into the team that have the gap that's there. So I think we're about out of time. So
thank you, Ken. I think this was very, very interactive.
Yeah.
And
very good.
Bringing in
Very
Maslow's theory
Yes.
and giving that
Very
analogy
good.
was
Yes,
great.
thank you. There you go. Yeah, hold the book up. We'll do a little photo shoot here. There you go. Thank you. Go ahead, sorry.
Thank you.